We will go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Wanted to introduce Stefan. Stefan Woehlke he's just finishing up his dissertation work at the University of Maryland. And I'll take this virtual background off, Stefan, in case this is too much. But Stefan, for those of you that were here before 2010 at Montpelier, Stefan used to be one of our crew members. And Stefan worked with us from 2008 till 2010. And I remember Stefan, you and I feel like we became good friends on that road trip back from Florida from SHA, where you stayed up with me all night while I drove, and you we spoke, so I'd stay awake. So, but let me go back to the normal background here, and there. So, but yeah, Stefan has been working on his dissertation on African American households here at Montpelier for, gosh, the last, really been involved in this project for the last decade, Stefan. We initially looked at African American and started looking at the regional context for African American households, especially after emancipation, with the work we did at the Gilmore Cabin. And the descendants, we had a steering committee that was involved in looking at what time period to restore the Gilmore Cabin to. And the descendant committee that was part of that asked for, some context for the Gilmores and the Gilmore family in relationship to other African American households. So we started research on that, then got a couple of small grants from the Virginia Humanities Foundation for that. And I think that's where you saw that report initially, Stefan, and really took an interest in that, and then started working on this for your dissertation, and have really combined many, many resources that go far beyond Montpelier to look at the African American households in Western Orange County from, when folks first arrived, were kidnapped and brought here, to working as enslaved Americans, and then all the way into the present. So I will let you take it away, Stefan, but we're really proud to have you, finalizing your dissertation. I can't wait to hear your presentation. So this is going to be kind of a mini dissertation defense presentation. Because Stefan, do you have that scheduled yet? Oh, you're muted, Stefan.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you'll know when it's scheduled because you have to agree to it. So,
that's true. Okay. All right.
In 3 or 4 weeks is when we're shooting for.
Okay, very good. Well, if it's anything like what you've written, it is going to be amazing, and really looking forward to this presentation. So Stefan, I'll let you take it away. Some of the Alan Jackson descendants are in the audience, Madeline England and Dr. Iris Ford, and other members of the extended descendant community here at Montpelier are here as well. The Frenches, Joanne, Brock. So really excited to have everyone here to listen to what Stefan has to present and to hear some feedback.
All right, well, thank you, Matt. I'm guessing if people can't hear me, they'll shout at me. Welcome. I'm really excited to give this presentation. There's really a lot I tried to cover in my dissertation, and it's been hard to condense it all down even into this extended version of my defense presentation. So, hopefully I'll have a chance to come back and talk in a little more detail about some of the subjects I touch on today. But in general, kind of to sum it up, I'm going to be focusing on the materiality of African American households in Western Orange County, and more specifically in the Montpelier vicinity. Basically, we're operating under some understandings about the context for the time period of analysis. And so I'm mainly focusing on the period basically from the 1840s up until the 1920s. So that's from the time that Montpelier was being divided and sold off by Dolly Madison up until women's suffrage, essentially. And generally, throughout this time period and throughout American history, African Americans have been operating within one form or another of a white supremacist social structure. And that social structure has many different systems that are operating within side of it. And so here, the main ones I'll be focusing on today are rural capitalism, racism, and sexism, but also social systems related to religion, age, gender, sexuality. All of these things play a role in people's experiences, their lived experiences, as well as what they see as their opportunities, their sort of the spectrum of possible decisions and actions that they can take in any one situation. And so these intersecting systems within this larger white supremacist, you would call it a superstructure, I suppose, manifest in some very clear ways. Anti-Black violence and lynching, sexual violence, economic exploitation, undereducation and miseducation. And so we'll be talking about the materiality of some of these things today and how they show up in the historical as well as the archaeological record in the Montpelier area. So my main question that I'm trying to get a better understanding of are, what are the long-term strategies and short-term tactics that African Americans in the Montpelier area employ to support their families during this really dynamic period of social change from 1840s to 1920s. And again, that's really the period I'm focusing on, although many of these concepts could be pushed further back in time as well as brought right up to the present. So it's just something to think about as I'm going through, is maybe how are some of these things, how might they have played out in the later 20th century or throughout the Madison ownership of property in that area. And to do this analysis, it really requires a theoretical framework, which is based in a foundation of what's called intersectionality or intersectional theory. And the basic tenets of intersectionality are that you have these multiple social forces or social systems operating within society, and they're not operating in isolation of one another. So racism does not operate in isolation of sexism. And neither of those operate in isolation from the capitalist system in which people are living. And these are mutually supporting, mutually constructing social systems that over time, they become reliant on one another to maintain sort of the status quo, essentially, or the dominant power relations of any one time period. And so people's position, people's race, sexuality, gender identity, economic status, all impacts their understanding of the social system, their worldviews, as well as the actions and practices that they engage in at any particular time. And so to get at this really complex intersection and how those intersections are changing over time and how people are responding to it, you need a lot more than just the archaeological data. And so this is what Matt was mentioning. It really, you got to pull from many different sources in order to create a more nuanced interpretation and analysis or understanding of what people were doing in the past and how people were trying to do the best they could to support themselves and their families. So in my dissertation, I won't really touch on all of these in the presentation today, but in my research, I relied a lot on historical newspapers, both white newspapers and Black newspapers. They give you completely different types of information. Both have value for trying to understand what was happening in the past. Historical, federal, and agricultural censuses, Maps and aerial imagery, other historical documents like deeds have been really important, as well as wills. Discussions with descendants. So some of the people who are listening today, and you know, as I continue this work, I look forward to expanding the number of descendants who I can speak to about kind of the changes in Orange County throughout the last few generations. And it also relies on archaeological surveys, so the metal detector surveys I know Matt has spoken about many times, as well as kind of your more traditional archaeological excavations. So all of these different data sources contribute to developing an intersectional understanding of the past. So my research, largely for my dissertation, focused on 5 households. 2 were enslaved domestic sites. We don't know who exactly was living there before the Civil War and emancipation. One of which is located kind of near where the barns are, kind of across from Lewis Hall. And another one is located in the East Woods, kind of along a ridge line up behind where those barns are located that you can kind of see across from the archaeology lab. You can envision that. Another site is the Alan Jackson birthplace, which of course was initially a slave quarter, and it got converted into a tenant farmer's domestic site in the 19th century. And that's really the only site that was continuously occupied both during the periods of enslavement as well as in the emancipation, post-emancipation period. And then also the Gilmore cabin, which Matt mentioned earlier, and we'll talk quite a bit, especially about the architecture of the Gilmore cabin and its changes over time. And then the Walker family house site, which didn't make it on this list. But the Walker family and the Taylor family both lived on neighboring properties, kind of near where Bassett House is located, and what's called the Sarah Johnson House. So they're off of, I guess it's Eastgate Road, where the exit used to be when you were leaving the property. So, and the 3 forms of material culture I'm going to focus on are materiality related to literacy and education, related to domestic architecture, and then related to the visibility of African-American domestic sites on the landscape. So kind of looking at multiple scales of materiality to get a better understanding of these larger intersecting power relations. So a little bit more about intersectionality. The term is something that many people are probably starting to pick up in the news a little bit. The Black Lives Matter movement is really rooted in intersectional theory. And the term intersectionality was originally coined by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, who was and is a critical theorist, a writer of critical race theory. And the first time when she really talks about the intersection of 2 social forces, she was talking about the impact of the intersections of race and sex on the way that anti-discrimination laws are practiced within American society. And so that article was published back in 1989. But the idea that there are these social forces which are intersecting, that are impacting people differently, can be seen in the writings and speeches of Black women, going back to the earliest writings and speeches of Black women that we have here in the United States, and undoubtedly even before that. So a lot of people have probably heard the name Sojourner Truth, and she's often cited as kind of one of the earliest speakers that talks about intersecting economic forces and racial forces and gender forces, especially her speech, Ain't I a Woman or Aren't I a Woman, depending on which translation you read. But even before who was a Black woman living in the Northeast, in Boston and then New York City, was quite clear in the way that she was able to demonstrate how economic forces, racism, and sexism all intersected to affect her life, her opportunities, and the opportunities of other Black women throughout the nation. And so the main point here is that these are really very old ideas. They've changed, they've become more well-developed within kind of a formal social theory or social science framework. But these are things that have shaped the understandings and practices of Black women and many Black men as well for hundreds of years at this point. So again, the intersecting systems of power that I'll be talking about today are rural capitalism and kind of the industrialization of rural capitalism and the mechanization of rural agriculture, racism, and sexism. So rural capitalism. We all, of course, are living in a capitalist system, but the way capitalism is practiced differs depending on the context that it's in, as well as the rules and regulations through which the capitalist system operates. So there's never been a truly free market capitalist system ever. So that's kind of an idealized myth of capitalism. But particularly in rural capitalism, there are 5 factors which really impacted the way in which people were forced to live, essentially. And one is unfair competition due to economies of scale. And what that means is that the large landholders, the large farmers, because they have so much more land, they're able to outcompete in many ways smaller farmers. Because they have more land, they're able to invest in tools and technologies for the mechanization of agriculture, which allows them to plant more land with less labor input. They're able to invest in the new chemical fertilizers that were coming out in the 19th and throughout the 20th century to increase their yields, where small farmers often didn't have the resources to do that. They were able to only farm a certain portion of their property. And by having a cycle with fallow fields, you're able to maintain your soil quality over a long term, where small farmers were often forced to plant all their land, or at least the vast majority of it. And so over time, their yields would decrease. The command of spatial relations is related. So obviously, excuse me. People with the most money are able to control spatial relations. The wealthy landholders, after the Civil War, many of them did sell small plots of land to African-American farmers, small-scale farmers, but they weren't selling the best agricultural land. You know, they were selling the least productive land, the land that had the steepest slopes, the stuff that they couldn't really exploit to the fullest potential. And so because of that control over the spatial relations and who had access to what land and how much of it, African Americans were put at a disadvantage. The fracturing of the class consciousness is where you also see a lot of connections between both the economic system and racism. If you think about kind of small-scale farmers, tenant farmers, no matter their race, are sharing an economic relationship with the large-scale landholders. But because of racism, it makes it difficult to build solidarity between the working class farmers in order to have some control over negotiations and relations with the large-scale farmers. So racism was really a key tool in breaking down the formation of that class consciousness. Another interesting thing that was happening in the 19th and 20th century in rural context was the de-skilling of the workforce. So part of that de-skilling is the mechanization that was taking place, but it was also the manipulation of the seeds. So as you have an increase in the development of hybrid seeds, many of those seeds were being developed for particular traits, but they were not as successful over multiple generations. So it started to decrease the ability of farmers to collect seed from their crop every year and plant it the next year. It meant they would have to go back to the seed supply companies and buy seeds every single year. This is only accelerated throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries with the genetically modified crops. And many of the Supreme Court cases that have protected large agribusiness and basically made it illegal for many farmers to save seeds and try to plant them the next year. And then lastly, removal of workers from their means of production. That also gets tied to the ability to control seed production as well as control the land. So in systems where you have sharecropping arrangements or tenant farming arrangements, the workers, the agricultural workers who are living and working on that land are not able to really control the way in which the land is being treated. So it means they're not able to make long-term improvements. And even if in cases where tenant farmers did work to make long-term improvements to their agricultural fields, in some cases in the US, as well as places like Ireland, once those fields were improved, they would essentially be moved to another marginal piece of land and then be expected to improve that land and then get moved to another marginal piece of land. And so the system of capitalism in the 19th and 20th centuries really limited the ability of small-scale farmers to support themselves and to improve their economic standing. And that was only further restricted because of racism and sexism. And racism, in addition to those economic systems I was just talking about, it also manifests itself in things like political redistricting. So this is not something new. This was something that was taking place in the 19th century within decades of emancipation and African-American men earning the right to vote. Orange County completely was redistricted to essentially eliminate the power of the Black vote. This is something that Orange County historian wrote in 1907. He wrote about with a lot of pride. As you can imagine at that time period, this was not a secret. This was not some backdoor deal. This was standard practice across the country to use redistricting among other tools to essentially disenfranchise the African-American male vote. You also have groups like the Ku Klux Klan who were active at various points in Orange County's past and continue to be active today, as well as many other kind of splinter groups who could historically be tied to the Ku Klux Klan but now go by different names that are still active in Orange County to this day. And so that is one very clear system of racial oppression which limits the way in which African Americans are able to live their lives in Orange County. And related to that, but extending beyond it, are lynchings. There were lynchings that took place all across the country, but within just a couple miles of Montpelier, I've been able to identify at least 2 episodes of lynching in the early 20th century in historic newspapers, which, as you can imagine, are just horrific things to read. And, you know, it's impossible for me to understand how living next door to where these events were taking place, you know, would impact the way in which you go about your life. It's really something that I don't think anybody could ever understand unless they were, you know, living through something like that. And lastly, access to education. Education, of course, is a huge component of the African-American story in this nation. And education is something that Black intellectuals have always been calling for in one form or another. But kind of what they saw as the ideal education definitely varied depending on the time period and the perspectives of the intellectual in question. But access to education or the limited access to education or after desegregation and integration, the miseducation of African Americans has played a huge role in the opportunities which African Americans had to choose from. Sexism, of course, is another really dominant social force throughout this time period. So women, of course, were not able to vote at any point in the time period that we're going to be talking about today. They lacked access to financial systems and financial tools. They often needed to have husbands essentially approve of any financial dealings they had. There's very few exceptions to this. There are, of course, some earlier interesting examples with white women in Orange County, particularly Frances Madison. But it historically was a very explicit challenge, and today there's still issues related to accessing financial systems and tools that many women face, especially when it comes to things like business ownership, for example. Sexual violence, which is something, again, that Black women have been writing and talking about as long as we have records of what Black women were saying in this nation. And sadly, that is something that has not gone away. It has not changed. The Me Too movement was a hopeful time, but clearly we still have a long way to go when it comes to sexual violence and the way that it's practiced in our country. And women also, no matter their race, lacked access to education. It was very difficult to get a college education. It was also difficult to get a high school education throughout the period that I'm really focusing on today. And in many cases, women, young girls were not sent to school at all because of the out-of-pocket costs that families had and the difficult decisions that many working class families, no matter the race, had to make about, you know, who is going to be able to benefit most from an education in society, and you know, how what's the word I'm looking for? You know, how best to use those families' resources to support the family as a whole.
Oh, hey, Stefan.
Yeah.
Hey, just wanted to give you a time check. It's 12:30, and I was hoping that we could give like at least 10 minutes for questions, and we try to wrap these up at 1, just so otherwise people tend to need to leave at that point. So thank you, Stefan.
I'll speed up a little bit here.
No, you're doing great though. Just wanted to let you do a time check with you.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, the clock was out of view over here. All right. So no matter what your position is in society, whether you're a rich white person or a working class African American, your decisions, your opportunities, your understanding of the world are shaped by your position within the larger society and within those intersecting systems of power that I was just talking about. And so nobody can escape that, but of course, some people have fewer opportunities and face more forms of oppression than others. And so that's just something to keep in mind. White people are still impacted by racism. Men are still impacted by sexism. And so this is not something that is just applicable to understanding the practices and material culture of African Americans. It's something that should be applied to understand people across the spectrum of society. So how do we develop this understanding of people's behaviors within this dynamic white supremacist society? Well, archaeological excavation is, of course, one tool for that. Kind of your traditional site level excavations are what's going to give you a significant amount of material culture to understand how different households were living and how their lived experiences changed through time. Historical newspapers, especially historical Black newspapers, have been extremely helpful in understanding some of the more day-to-day lived experiences of African Americans, including in Orange County. The Baltimore Afro-American actually published kind of a running series of kind of social articles, I guess you could say, and Jacksontown and Orange and Gordonsville were often towns where people were writing in talking about community members that were holding social gatherings, social functions, card games, or writing about, you know, children that were going off to high school in Fredericksburg or down to Petersburg. And so they really help highlight some of the things that you can't really get to with the archaeological record. Historical maps and aerial imagery allow us to understand kind of the spatial organization of the community, and that can be further bolstered with archaeological survey data that gives us a better idea of kind of the buildings we see in an aerial image, what were they being used for at different times in the past, as well as using federal censuses and agricultural censuses to kind of flesh out our understanding of spatial relations, who was living where, and kind of where do they fall within this complex social matrix. And so literacy and education, as I mentioned earlier, have always been seen as critical to improving the lives of African Americans. And we can see the materiality of this movement towards literacy and the significance of education in many of the artifacts we recover on sites in Montpelier. So writing slates on the top right and the slate pencils, that's something that's been recovered at most enslaved domestic contexts on the property, at least in some small form. But what I was able to show is there does seem to be an increase in the quantity of materials related to literacy, as well as in the diversity of literacy-related materials. And so in the bottom right, there's a stoneware inkwell. This is actually from a different site, but it's very similar. This is kind of a whole version of one that was recovered from the Walker family house site on the Montpelier property that was occupied after the Civil War up until 1900. You also have evidence of graphite pencils that start showing up in the archaeological records. So over time, you can see the materiality of this expands in quantity and in the diversity of the material. And another interesting piece of evidence for understanding literacy are signed legal legal documents and written letters. Like the Taylor family that lived next to the Walker family on the property from the same time period, post-Civil War up until 1901. The husband, the father, was not literate, and he signed his legal documents with an X. But his wife, Rebecca Taylor, signed with her own name. And it shows, that's an example of how sort of a gender division of labor and responsibility within a household can manifest itself. So at a time after the Civil War, when a lot of African-American families took great pride in the fact that the mothers didn't have to leave the household in some cases. They didn't have to leave the household to do additional labor for other people, in particular white landholders. One of the ways in which I think the Taylor family kind of used new gender roles, evolving gender roles, was in the role of education. So as the mother, Rebecca, was able to learn this skill and teach it to the children, even though the father was really focused on kind of running the farm essentially, and kind of the more day-to-day labor of having a profitable small farm, which was very, very difficult during that time period. Another component or piece of material culture related to education is the Jacksontown School. So this is a school that was not built with public funds. This was built by the community and was eventually brought into the public school system in Orange County. But the fact that the community in Jacksontown was able to pool the resources, economic resources and labor resources together to construct their own school shows the significance of education for that community, providing a place for structured education for children up to about the 8th grade level. Architecture is also a very important class of material culture that the Black households in Orange County used to navigate and negotiate the systems of economic exploitation and racism and sexism in the Montpelier area. So this image here is similar to the types of cabins that have been excavated at Montpelier from the Madison period. You can see the wattle and daub or stick and mud chimney on the left-hand side with the sticks so that if it does catch fire, it can be pulled away from the house. Over time, you have a little bit more substantial architecture. And so this is something that's, again, it's not a picture from Montpelier, but the architectural, the construction methods are very similar to what you see in the later antebellum period. You start to see brick and stone chimneys with slave quarters. And you start to see some that are being elevated above the ground. Of course, the domestic quarters in the south yard of Montpelier were built above the ground, but that was particular to how Madison wanted to portray the housing of African Americans on the property. Most of the field quarters were built right on the ground level until you get to the mid-19th century, right before the Civil War and the post-war period. So the two late slave quarters that I studied in my dissertation, one had a solid stone, dry laid stone foundation, and the other one, it's not exactly clear if it was built up on small piers, or I'm guessing it was probably built directly on the surface of the ground out in the East Woods. But they both had at least a chimney base and foundation made of brick or stone. After the Civil War, you have new houses being built for African-American families. So as I mentioned earlier, very few slave quarters continued to be used after the Civil War in Montpelier. It's different in other parts of the country, other parts of the state. but in the immediate Montpelier vicinity, that's not really the pattern that we see. And so in the photo on the right, that's what was built out of salvage materials from Civil War forts, and that's the first Gilmore cabin that was built on the property right behind the Gilmore cabin that's there today. And so there's a little bit of the stone chimney from the Gilmore cabin that you can see on the left side of this image. And so those sorts of structures are what was being built by African-American families immediate post-war. They abandoned the slave quarters, they moved wherever they could, and because so many of the forests have been cleared and these winter huts were being built for the Civil War encampments, there was a lot of material that was readily accessible for building new homes. And so these are not large wood timbers, but they were available, and so people used them. And so the Gilmore family obviously did, but also the Walker family and Taylor family seem to have pretty ephemeral structures that would have been very similar, raised up on piers, and by piers I just mean large stones essentially, with a brick or stone foundation to the chimney, and then a pretty ephemeral structure above it. And so in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see part of the excavation of the Walker family's chimney base where the large stones are. And the units on the right are outside of the structure. And the one unit on the left is inside where the structure would have been located. The second Gilmore cabin, which is the Gilmore cabin we all know and love today, was built by George and Polly Gilmore in 1872 or 1873. And it's a much more substantial structure. The timbers were probably purchased and imported. And the fact that it is still standing today is a testament to the fact that it was a much more substantial structure than the first Gilmore cabin. It was larger, it had a substantial loft area, and for families that could afford it, it's a pretty common form of architecture for that time period all throughout Virginia. In the early 20th century, William Gilmore, George Gilmore's son, put an addition on the Gilmore cabin, the second Gilmore cabin. And this is an interesting addition because he gave the building symmetry, except for the awning on the front side. What he did with his addition was it now has dual chimneys, one on either side. You had two windows, which were symmetrical, and a door in the middle. He also built a dividing wall between the staircase and the main room of the original Gilmore cabin, so that you actually had symmetry in your rooms. You had one room on either side and a central hall. And then similarly with the loft, you had one room on either side in the loft, and then the central area where the stairs went up. And this is interesting because this is something that a lot of Black intellectuals at the time were calling for. Booker T. Washington at the Hampton Institute and Tuskegee Institute advocated for building houses with symmetry, kind of using the architectural design of white elites during the time of slavery as a way to represent the humanity and the capacity of African Americans in the post-Civil War period. And so it aligns very much with what a lot of African Americans were calling for. Another thing is it's in many ways just a slightly scaled down version of the Dr. James Madison house, who was the person that enslaved William Gilmore's parents. So here you are, one generation later, the son of the man enslaved by Dr. James Madison is able to use his house, which is right next door, to say essentially like, I am equal. I deserve the same respect that you do. And then here's a photo from 1937 of the Alan Jackson birthplace. And this was originally built as log cabin. It probably would have been similar to the second Gilmore cabin, a little more substantial than some of the other structures because it was close to the main house. And the people living there were also had, let's call them connections to the owners of Bloomfield, the plantation the house was on. And then after emancipation, there was an addition. So the right side of the structure in this image was an addition put on post-emancipation to try and entice tenant farmers to come and move in and work the land essentially. So that addition is a frame addition that was built up on small piers, but that's not part of the original house based on initial assessments of the foundation and piers that are still visible on the surface of that site today.
Hey, Stefan, I just wanted to give you a time check. It's around 12:47, so this is great.
The last thing. All right.
There's a lot to pack in.
Yes, so I'll have to come back and talk more. But one of the things that was a new methodology in my dissertation was the use of what's called total view sheds. And a total view shed is basically taking a map of an area and calculating how much of the landscape around it is visual from each point across the entire landscape. And what that allows us to do is start to identify if structures were being built in highly visible areas or low visibility areas. And one of the things I was able to show is that during periods of enslavement, African-American domestic sites, slave quarters, tended to be built in places that were highly visible to the immediate surroundings where you could surveil it. But if you were looking at the landscape writ large, they were in low visibility areas on the landscape. So they were kind of hidden from view as you were moving through the landscape, but they were highly visible for the overseer essentially, where they could surveil everything essentially that was happening where the field quarters were located. One of the interesting things that happens after emancipation is you have a big shift in the visibility from African-American domestic sites. So this dark blue line, the bold blue line on the left side, these are all the late slave quarters, the slave quarters that were present on the landscape in give or take 1860. And so at that point, they were the least visible on the landscape of any point in history as far as we can tell. And this is with a 2,000 meter radius from the site. So that's a pretty big area around the structure. And then the purple line that's bold on the far right, this is the visibility 12 years or so, 15 years after emancipation, about 1880. And you can see that they are placed in much more highly visible areas on the landscape. And so one possibility is that they were being built on the landscape to, again, as a symbol to show like we are here, this is our land, it's not just rich white people's land essentially, and visually placing themselves in those positions. And another possibility is that because of threats of racialized violence, it was important to build your house in a highly visible area so that if something were to happen, your neighbors would be able to see you and potentially come to your aid. And so there's additional analyses I want to do to look at that. But I think that's, it's pretty much the end of my statements. So hopefully we have a little bit more time for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Stefan. That was wonderful. There's a lot of folks have, a number of folks have written in some questions about accessing the information on both lynching, but then also on redistricting. And I'll put you in contact with folks. And if anyone is interested, if you put your email in the chat, you could do it privately to me. I could send you additional information, Stefan's contact, and some of the reports we have here at Montpelier on these same topics. But would love to open it up for questions. Let's see. Yeah, and Stefan just put in his email as well. And yeah, see, people are putting in. And also, we're recording this, so we can send this along to folks who have missed it. We'll be sending this out. So if anybody wants a recording, we can send along.
Great. The articles on lynchings in Orange County that I have found, one was in the Baltimore Afro-American, described, you know, it's very traumatic. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'll share with anybody who wants to email me. But it describes two siblings from a well-established family just outside of Gordonsville who lived next to the White Cemetery, and they continued to take land from their family to expand the White Cemetery. And so in their, they were getting older at this point, and they had pretty much had enough. And so 300 state police officers showed up at their door to remove them from their family property. And they had stockpiled weapons and ammunition in their home. And they shot the sheriff when he tried to break through the door. And that led to a gun battle lasting for hours. And then the brother and sister ultimately were killed in that altercation. And being in the Baltimore Afro-American, this article was very detailed. The reporter interviewed people from the community. The other article was in, I think it was the Washington Post. I'll have to double check that. But it described an African-American bootlegger who a sheriff and deputy were going after him to this, going essentially to arrest him. And the sheriff and deputy never came out of the woods. So eventually they took a taxi to go make this arrest. And the taxi driver eventually went back to town and said, you know, they never came back. And that's when essentially a mob formed to go after and find this young man who they tracked to a barn, and he refused to leave. So they lit the barn on fire, and the young man took his own life. So there are, and that coming from the Washington Post, it's a very different read than the kind of article you got from the Baltimore Afro-American. So there's not quite as much information about really what was happening. But then the other things from the Baltimore Afro-American, where families were posting, I kind of liken it to, you know, Facebook today. It's just all these short little posts from families just kind of letting people know kind of what they're up to, because communication is really hard at that time. And you also have a lot of migration. So people from Jacksontown were moving to Richmond, Washington, DC, Baltimore. And so this was a way that people could kind of connect with their hometown, you know, or their home place back in the countryside, was through these articles that the Baltimore African American would publish.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Madeline. How are you, Stefan?
Good. Good to see.
It was interesting. You had that picture of Jacksontown School.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any? Did you come across any other pictures of Jacksontown from that era?
Not really. That photo actually came from an Orange County public school. Mm-hmm. What do they call it?
Archives or something?
Yeah. Well, it was one.
It was an inventory.
Yeah, an inventory of schools in Orange County. That's what it was.
Okay. Okay.
But I'm definitely interested in collecting more of those images and placing them on the landscape using what's called GIS or geographic systems. I know Matt's presented on that as well a little bit, but I think it will help, you know, visualize the changes that were taking place in Jacksontown over time if I'm able to do that. And of course, hopefully will be done with my dissertation in a few weeks, but I certainly don't see my work in the area ending, which I know I've spoken with you about, Madeline, but I look forward to continuing to build relationships with members of the descendant community and expanding the archaeological interpretation of African-American life beyond the boundaries of the Montpelier Foundation, where a lot of it is kind of confined to at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Stefan, I just talked to a lady yesterday. She's a member of the Page family who lived on Jacksontown Road. She actually remembers where the school is. She's in her 90s and is going to show me in the next couple of weeks when the ticks and bugs go down with the cold weather.
Keep me posted on that. Maybe I'll try to do a little, I don't know, keep me posted. I don't really have information on other schools in the Madison district beyond kind of what was in that inventory list. But you know, understanding a more detailed understanding, especially in the 20th century, of kind of how the education system in Orange County was operating is something I'm really interested in. Madeline's mom was a teacher, and so talking to her, I've learned a lot about kind of the mid 20th century educational landscape. And I look forward to kind of expanding, you know, my period of focus closer and closer to the present day, because making those connections are really important. And it's something that archaeologists need to do a better job of, and I plan on doing that myself. So.
The OC, Orange County African American Historical Society, did an exhibit on Orange County schools about 10 years ago. I'll share that with the emails I send out. It's on the, I think it's on the OCHS website as well.
So there is a question here from Ms. French about where other newly emancipated enslaved people moved to. And so our best information on that is from the metal detector surveys from Montpelier. They do a very good job of identifying where these sites are, and I can send you a map of the ones we know of that I've been able to document that are on the property and immediately off of the property. But we don't have many exact locations immediately off the property because, excuse me, they often were not mapped in the few maps from that time period. And then in the 1937 aerial imagery, the less substantial structures are already gone by the time you get to the first aerial imagery. And so that is one thing that additional archaeological survey will really help us understand, is that larger changes in the landscapes and where exactly people were living. And it'll also help all the other kind of quantitative landscape archaeology analyses, because the more data points you have, for lack of a better term, the better you are able to understand the diversity of experiences and practices of people in the past. I don't know if I missed another, I'm trying to scroll through.
Yeah, I'm looking through as well, Stefan. Well, we're right at 1 o'clock. What I'll do is I'll get with Stefan and we'll do a combined email to everyone who's put their email on this chat list. And we can send out additional information for anyone that's interested, like the links to the exhibit on the school, some of the research reports we've got at Montpelier, some maps, and we're actually working on a larger GIS map on African-American sites throughout the Southwest Mountain chain. And that's something that the Montpelier Descendant Committee is heading up. So there's a lot going on that we're going to be able to build with what you've done, Stefan, and really combine forces with a lot of folks to build the history up and make it more accessible. So, but wanted to thank you, Stefan, for taking the time to give this presentation, but then also for doing your dissertation on Montpelier and wider Western Orange County. It's really going to be exciting to see you complete that, and then also what publications you'll get from that, and then working with all of us. So Stefan came to Montpelier in 2008 and has never left, which is wonderful. So Montpelier has that effect on people, and certainly the region does as well with the wonderful community that we've got here. So, but thank you, everybody. We'll, again, if you put your email on the list, if you miss putting your email in, just email, you can email me at mreeves@montpelier.org, and I think Stefan put his email in there as well.
Yes, I did, yep.
So, and if anyone, we do these Wednesday lunch and learns once a week. We've got a schedule for the rest of October, and then we're going to do them every other week starting in November. So if you'd like to be on that mailing list, just send me an email and we can get you on there. So, but it's so wonderful to see everybody today. And like I said, we've got this recorded and we'll make the recording available for everyone as well. So, but good to see everybody, and thanks again for tuning in today. So, bye everyone.
Hey.